For the past several weeks, we've been spending some time encouraging you to ask questions, and last week, Pastor Mike spent some time trying to answer one of those questions. I know it's a question that for some of you, maybe you never even asked. Maybe you were raised in the church, you were raised in a home that believed that Jesus claimed that he was God, and for you that wasn't a hurdle. But perhaps you knew somebody that it was a hurdle for. This week, I've invited another one of our friends to come up and to share with us and to just kind of wrestle with a question that it might be another one of those that you're sitting there going, I've never had this doubt before in my life. But, and as I know Rick is going to share, there are a lot of people who have. And what we can do, even if it's not something we wrestle with, is we can prepare even more how to go forth and how to help give the reason for the hope that we have, how to help answer these questions. So, Rick, thank you for stepping out of your comfort zone to be here this morning and to share with us for the time that I know that you have put into preparing for this moment. I look forward to what it is that God has put on your heart for all of us this morning. Would you welcome Rick Snider this morning?
Thank you, Justin, I think. And thank you, Pastor Mike and the youth team. That last song there, First Thing First, reminds me of something that an early mentor of mine in business he would say it repeatedly. Always remember to keep the main thing the main thing. So this morning as I share, I'll try to do just that. First things first, keep the main thing the main thing. And as Pastor Justin had mentioned a couple weeks ago, he called a few of us men together and set us around a table, and he started talking about his ideas for this series on questions, and that we shouldn't shy away from them. So questions are good. You know, they're going to teach us, we're going to learn more from questions a lot of times, questions that we ask, and then questions that are asked of us. In daily practice, my office, I use questions every day to answer questions that patients come to me with. See, patients typically come into the office with the same 4 basic questions. Now, they may ask them in different words, but they really are the same 4 questions. What's wrong with me? Can you help me? How long is it going to take? And how much is it going to cost? Now, sometimes there's a patient that asks a 5th question, and we actually are really encouraged by that, and that is when they ask, what do I need to be doing to help this process along? And those are the ones that are going to get better faster. Questions can also challenge us to learn more about ourselves. This year, several of us are reading through the Bible Project New Testament in a year together. And my wife and Doug and Mark and Zach and Jake and a couple others, I asked my kids if they would like to join in. And my son Eric has been reading along with us. He tells me, I don't know how he does this, he tells me he's trying to read through the Bible as if he's reading it for the very first time, through the eyes of someone that hasn't read it before. Well, just about every day, he sends me a question from that perspective. Well, a lot of times those questions are pretty straightforward, and you can answer it right there in the scripture. But occasionally there's a question that makes me pause, and I have to back up, and I have to seek out an answer myself. You know, the back and forth exchange that we've had, I have learned far more so far this year than I would have if I'd just been reading it through it myself. What a tremendous blessing. However, I do have to admit, every now and then, I see that little kid looking at me and going, but why, Dad? You know, some of the things that we're talking about, the answer, because I said so, just doesn't cut it. You see, we are called out in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15. Come on now. Keep the main thing, right? We're called out in chapter 3, verse 15 of 1 Peter. Always be prepared to give a good answer for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. As I mentioned not long ago, Pastor Justin called us together, and he set us around a table. And he told about the questions that he thought he would like for us to answer. And he shoved across the table to me the question, did Jesus really die on the cross? Or was his death faked? I paused, had a question of my own. Do people really think that Jesus didn't die on the cross? I mean, that answer seems so obvious to me. Are there really people that think that? That he just was taken down from the cross before he died and put in the tomb? Those three guys sitting around the table all nodded their head yes. That thought had never occurred to me, that Jesus only appeared dead whenever he was put in the tomb. So I'll just simply ask you, how about you? Do you believe that Jesus really died on the cross, that he was dead whenever they put him in the tomb? Or is there another explanation? Well, ever heard of Docetism? Well, neither had I. Docetism basically is rooted in first and second century teachings that Jesus did represent God in human form. But he was basically an illusion. And because Jesus only seemed to be real, he couldn't really be crucified and die. Huh, Pastor Mike? Doesn't that sound like something right out of the Matrix movie to you? Now, if you don't get the reference to the Matrix movie, you need to go back and get last week's message that Pastor Mike shared. You can find it on our church's YouTube page, I believe. So go look that up. Docetism. Yeah, they believed that Jesus was merely an illusion here. Well, that was largely deemed heretical by the time that they had the first Nicene Convention in 325 AD. However, believe it or not, it does occasionally reappear. However, I think we can get a far better explanation if we go straight to other first century writings, and of course I'm referring to the Bible. A year ago I stood up here and we talked about was the Bible true and is it reliable? I presented evidence that proves the Gospels really are eyewitness accounts of Jesus here on this earth, and we can trust them. So, what does the Bible say then about Jesus and his crucifixion? Well, Jesus himself predicted his own death. He's quoted in Luke chapter 22, verse 22. For it has been determined that the Son of Man must die. Matthew writes in chapter 27, verse 50. Jesus passionately called out, took his last breath, and gave up his spirit. Luke, now he was a physician, he writes in chapter 23, verse 46. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said that, he breathed his last. Mark writes in chapter 15, verses 37 through 39. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. The curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion that was standing guard over him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he believed that he was the Son of God. John writes in chapter 19, verses 33 and 34, when the soldiers came to Jesus, they saw he was already dead. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once came out blood and water. We'll circle back to that in a moment. Mark in chapter 15, verse 44, Pilate was amazed to hear that Jesus was already dead, so he summoned that Roman officer who was standing guard over Jesus and his crucifixion. And the Roman officer confirmed it. Paul even confirms his belief in Philippians in chapter 2. And when he appeared as a human being, he humbled himself still more by becoming obedient even to death, death on a stake as a criminal. Now, I suppose many of you are like me, and we could probably just stop right here. We know the Gospels can be trusted. We shared that evidence a year ago. They are eyewitness accounts. We can trust them. Enough evidence for me. But what about that original question that I asked Pastor Mike, Pastor Justin, and Zach? Are there really some who question Jesus dying on the cross? Well, type that into an internet search engine, and guess what? Yes, there are. In fact, I was surprised to learn that there is estimated to be 1.9 billion people. That's billion with a B. 1.9 billion people here on earth that believe Jesus did not die on a cross. Now, who are these people? I mean, that makes up almost 25% of the world's population. Who are they? Well, I can tell you, the majority are Muslims studying the Quran. They do not believe Jesus was crucified. Now, Muhammad wrote in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 157, "But they neither killed nor crucified him. It was only made to appear so. Even those who argue for this crucifixion are in doubt. They have no knowledge whatsoever, only making assumptions. They certainly did not kill him." For me, I'm going to put a whole lot more trust in the documents that were written 550 years before Muhammad decided to pen this. You know, we have eyewitness accounts. You know something else? That sounds an awful lot like Docetism, doesn't it, Mike? It really does. And then we have the swoon theory. The swoon theory. Apparently there's been some through history that offer a different explanation. That Jesus didn't really die on the cross, but somehow survived. How could he? I mean, that was brutal, the crucifixion. Rather than dying on the cross, they believe that he merely fainted or went into a deep unconscious state. Upon being taken down from the cross, he was taken and placed in the tomb, and later, in the cool of the tomb, he rested and was revived, then appearing alive to his disciples. In addition to being called the apparent death theory, this explanation has been called the swoon theory or swoon hypothesis. But is it true? Murray Harris, New Testament professor at Trinity and Cambridge universities, I think those are some pretty prestigious universities, he writes, "This view, sometimes called the swoon theory or the apparent death theory, enjoyed considerable popularity among 18th and 19th century German rationalists, but the theory is now totally discredited." Apparently, this theory was based on the writings of Josephus, a first century Jewish historian. Josephus tells a story about a man he knew personally that survived after being taken down from the cross. But let's look at Josephus' statement. I quote, "I saw many captives crucified and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind and went with tears in my eyes to Titus and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down and to have the greatest care taken of them in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered." Okay. But those 3 men were taken down and placed in immediate medical care. Is that me? But those 3 men were taken down and placed into immediate medical care. They weren't laid in a stone tomb or stone slab and placed in a sealed tomb, were they? Gary Habermas, a New Testament scholar at Liberty, he writes about this. "A crucified but still living Jesus would have been in horrible physical shape." You'll hear about that in a bit. bloodied, bruised, pale, limping, unwashed, in obvious need of medical assistance. Such a condition would have hopelessly contradicted the disciples' belief that Jesus had appeared to them in a resurrected body. True, Jesus would be alive, but not raised. Such a sickly body would hardly be an inspiration for theology. In other words, after having been beaten and flogged, nailed to a cross, after being beaten, flogged, and nailed to a cross, if Jesus had survived and make it out of the tomb with his nail-spiked hands and feet, bloodied, limping, battered, disciples would not have called him victorious over death. Instead, they probably would have called a doctor. He certainly would not have been able to walk unrecognized for several miles on the road to Emmaus in that state. Bruce Chilton, New Testament professor at Yale, writes, "These executioners knew what they were doing, and theories that Jesus somehow physically survived the cross represent a combination of fantasy, revisionism, and half-baked science." John Crowson, an atheist New Testament scholar, he writes, "Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be." And Gerd Luderman, atheist New Testament and early Christianity professor at the University of Göttingen in Germany. Remember where Docetism come from? University of Göttingen in Germany. Luderman writes, "The fact of the death of Jesus as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable, despite hypothesis of a pseudo-death or a deception which are sometimes put forward. It need not be discussed further here." Well, so far, we have the Bible telling us that Jesus was crucified and died. I stood up here a year ago, and we talked about how we could trust the Bible and that it was eyewitness accounts. It's true, it's reliable. Here we have atheists and non-Christian scholars who agree Jesus walked the earth and was crucified. If you didn't have enough evidence already, I suppose you're like me and said, "Yep, I do. Jesus did in fact die." However, while preparing for today, I came across another doubting question. How do we know for certain Jesus was dead since there was no mention of a medical doctor or medical examiner checking and confirming he was dead? How can we, medically speaking, he was dead? As I thought about this question, I was reminded about an article published in the Journal of American Medical Association several years ago. It was titled, "On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ," and it summarizes the research of Dr. William Edwards, Department of Pathology at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and a few others. You know, Dr. Edwards and his team reviewed numerous medical journal publications on the death by crucifixion, as well as first century Roman historians, Cornelius Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Suetonius Tranquillus. Also included, reviewed Greek Samaritan historian Thallus, and then also the Jewish Talmud. Dr. Edwards goes into great detail about the events from the time of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane until he was taken down from the cross. Now, I'm not going to get into the gruesome and graphic descriptions that was presented in that document, but let's follow through Dr. Edwards' report. After his arrest in the garden, Jesus was paraded back and forth through the night from place to place, trial to trial, without rest, and highly unlikely being given any food or any water through that period of time. He was then flogged. Flogging, that was a legal preliminary to every Roman crucifixion. Now, what is that? They would take a leather whip that had multiple strands, The tips of those strands many times were dipped in lead to form little lead balls on the ends. Sometimes steel balls were sewn into those thongs, and they also would place broken pieces of sheep bone. Why? To inflict considerable pain, okay, and trauma into the individuals, deep bruising. It would weaken them to the point of exhaustion. And yes, sometimes they'd even died as a result of the flogging. Another customary part of crucifixion, okay? Jesus was then forced to carry the patibulum, or the crossbeam on the cross. It's estimated to weigh about 75 to 125 pounds. They were required to carry that from the area of flogging all the way outside the city walls to Golgotha, where they would be crucified. Well, this would cause further fatigue, and we know that Jesus himself was too weak to carry the patibulum the entire way, and they recruited Simon to kind of help him carry it along. Once they got there, 5 to 7 inch spikes were driven into the wrists of the person being crucified on the crossbeam, into the person's wrist. And they chose the wrist for a couple reasons. One, it was strong. It was going to lock them to that patibulum. And they would hit the median nerve. The median nerve. Anybody ever hit your funny bone? Well, that's the ulnar nerve. They would drive that stake through the median nerve. Why? Just simply to add to the excruciating pain the individual was feeling. Then they would lift that patibulum up and set it up on a vertical stake, or what was called a stipe. And they would lift that up high enough that the feet were off of the ground, so they were fully suspended from their arms. Then they would nail the feet to the cross, or that upright stake. You see, when a person was put in that upright and hanging from the cross, that would put them in pain and also in a state of inhalation. Let's mention this picture here. A year ago, I had the blessing of stepping into the Familia Sagrada. Absolutely beautiful. We walked into this church in Barcelona, Spain, and the sunlight shining through the stained glass windows, it was stunning. I mean, it just took you as soon as you walked through the doors. Absolutely beautiful. However, it was that crucifix right there that really drew my attention. You see, I think that represents a very accurate depiction of how Jesus was nailed to the cross. Hanging from the arms and the soles of the feet nailed to that vertical stipe. Now, as I said, that puts the body in a state of full inspiration. You breathed in about as deep as you could. But in order to breathe out, so you could breathe in the next breath, you had to push up with the legs, take pressure off of the arms in order to breathe out. Only then to relax and go into inhalation again. And that would go on until exhaustion and asphyxiation. The progression of asphyxiation would result in respiratory acidosis. What happens whenever you get into respiratory acidosis? Well, the heart will go into arrhythmia. Fluid will begin to fill up in the lungs and around the heart. The Roman guard that was put in place to stand guard over the crucifixion would not leave that post until they were sure of death. And to confirm that death, the guard would take a spear, pierce right between the lower ribs here, piercing the lung into the heart. The flow of water and blood would be a sure indication that the person was dead. So, what does our modern science say about the possibility of Jesus somehow surviving a Roman crucifixion? Per Dr. Edwards' report in the Journal of American Medical Association in 1986, he says, clearly, The weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Dr. Alexander Metherell, medical doctor, doctorate in engineering, and research scientist at the University of California, in a similar report, he said it pretty simply. There is absolutely no doubt that Jesus was dead. So, back to our original question. Did Jesus die on the cross, or was his death faked? The medical experts that studied the history of the Roman crucifixion were clearly convinced, without a doubt, Jesus was dead. Non-Christian first century historians' writings indicate they believed Jesus was dead. Atheist New Testament scholars at leading universities believe the fact of Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. And the eyewitness accounts in the Bible, those Gospels, they testify to Jesus' death on the cross, a belief they would die holding on to. Even an atheist friend of mine, called to chat with a short while ago, he attests there is little doubt Jesus was alive, walked the earth, and was crucified. So, with all this in mind, I'm going to leave you with two questions. And that very first question is the one that I was presented with. Do you believe Jesus died by crucifixion, that he was dead on that cross before they took him down? He was crucified. Do you believe that? Second question, I think I want you to give a little bit more thought to. And that is, why should that matter to you? Why is that so important? Why should it matter to you?
Who cares? I like that answer. Who cares if he died on a cross? Why does it matter if he'd had that mode of death? Why not just die of old age? Why not just live out life like most people live out life? Why couldn't he have gotten sick and died from that? Why couldn't he have just been killed while he was walking down the street? Why did it have to be that process? I think the argument could be made that it wasn't the cross. If he was in our world today, maybe it'd be lethal injection, or it'd be, some other mode of execution that we would use. But it matters because the God who created all of this, who came down and who told us all who he was, gave up everything for us. See, if he had just died of old age, well, we all hope to do that. But we don't hope to go to a cross. And he did it not for his gain, but for ours, so that we could have life. All that torture that Rick came up here and shared about, that was for us. The method of his death mattered because it was proof that the God over everything, who is all-powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere, cares enough for each and every one of us in here to give it all up. That's why it matters. That's why instead of just saying all that matters is he died, or that he came and lived and died, no, how he died matters. God, thank you for giving it all up for us. I don't understand it most of the time. God, I know what I've done. I know how I've lived. I've known the times that I've walked away, whether it was to deny you or just to temporarily walk away. Lord, I know. I know the pain that I've inflicted on you and the pain that I've inflicted on our relationship. I know the times that I've been the one and you left the 99 to come and pursue and to find me. And so, God, as I think about your sacrifice on the cross, it's without words. My gratefulness and my thankfulness is indescribable, Lord, that you would do that for me. That you would do that for each and every person sitting in this room, sitting in churches around the world. That you would do it for each and every person who is currently saying that you don't even exist. God, I believe that you came and you walked as one of us. I believe that you died on the cross, and I believe that you rose again, and I believe that you did it for us. And for that, Lord, I come in here on Sunday mornings and I worship with this group of people, you. And now as we leave here today, God, remind us of that so that we wouldn't leave our worship in this room, but we would take it to the world around us and we would worship you in their midst. That as our temptation is to worship the world, that we would remember the world has not sacrificed for us, you have. And we would keep our attention on you. God, thank you for the evidence that you've given us of your love for us. Amen.